Now we'll get started with the event itself. I'm very happy to be able to introduce to you a wonderful guest, Mr. Juan Yermo. He'll be talking to us about economy, post-COVID economy and society, and its reflection on pensions. Leadership and ensures that the organization fulfills its mandates. He oversees 2 horizontal policy units, new approaches to economic challenges and strategic foresight, and the Sherpa office. He previously held the position of Deputy Chief of Staff since 2014, and he joined the OECD in July of 1999 as head of the private pensions unit. And before he joined the OECD, he was a consultant in the Latin American Caribbean Department of the World Bank. He was a risk analyst at Bankers Trust, and he was an economist at SBC Warburg.
Muchísimas gracias, Waldo.
Thank you very much, Waldo. Thank you, Benigno, and thank you to the IDB for this invitation. It's truly an honor to be able to share our vision at the OECD regarding what has been happening with the pandemic, the vision of governments, and the impact on pensions, of course, 8 years later, as Diego was saying. And I'd also like to greet Diego, by the way, and Elio Sanchez, the 2 of them, and Waldo are friends of mine and have been for years. We're together in this sector, the pensions field, and it's a pleasure to be able to share some ideas with all of you. I also wanted to greet Professor Nick Barr. I think he'll be presenting after I do. It's an honor to be the presenter that comes right before Professor Barr. So I have some slides, if I may. I'll go on directly to the presentation.
Y básicamente me gustaría empezar un poco con
I would like to begin with the macroeconomic context we're in. As we all know, the pandemic has ravaged our economies and severely affected health in our different communities. In terms of the economic impact, what we can see is that it has taken a lot of time, and it is taking time for the recovery to kick in. There are a few OECD countries and non-OECD countries that are all seeing different rates of recovery. As we know, in Latin America and the Caribbean, recovery has been taking longer, and this is a fairly uneven landscape, particularly when it comes to what we're seeing today. We see that the reopening of the economy and the recovery in economies has been mainly driven by governments. We are seeing the GDP slowly start to pick up, but thanks to that effort from governments, economies have been able to keep their heads above water. Now, the major question here is, what will happen in the future? How will we be able to leave the pandemic behind? How will our economies recover, especially since we're still facing some roadblocks and challenges? And mainly that has to do with the fact that at least half of the population still has no access to pensions, as we know, or vaccines rather. So as we know, the richest countries have been the ones hoarding vaccine throughout the world. A lot of our countries and the lower income countries have a percentage of the population that is fully vaccinated that sometimes doesn't even reach 5%. And we have seen that there are some countries that have yet to actually gain access to vaccines, be that because they don't have actual access to them, or because there is a manufacturing challenge, or because there is a challenge when it comes to distribution. And what can be part of the scenario when trying to access these vaccines across countries. We see OECD countries represented here, countries where the vaccine rates are above 80%. That goes for Spain and France, for example. And we compare that with some countries in Eastern Europe and some countries in Latin America, and of course, countries in Africa where those vaccine rates are well below that. And as I said before, some of these countries aren't even at 5%. Now, one thing is clear. If we are to fully have our systems recover, our pension systems, if we want to make sure that our savings and long-term savings recover, there is going to need to be a vaccine program that can fully cover the population, or at least cover the majority of people. Now, of course, we know that none of us is really safe from COVID until we're all safe from COVID, as we heard from the Director General of the WHO. And we also know that we are going to have to live with the variants that will continue to appear and the mutations that will come. Vaccines are going to be with us for a long time, and this is going to be part of a repeated and recurring process. And so we're not really talking about post-COVID yet. I do believe that once we see more progress in vaccines, we will be able to talk about the post-pandemic. And the idea and the goal is to make this virus something that is under control, something that is just part of our society, the same way we address the flu, but something that doesn't really cause the major disruptions we have seen over the last couple of years, and particularly given the number of people who have died because of the virus. Now, if we look at the demographic aspect here, what we've seen in the pandemic is that, of course, we have the officially reported deaths, but in the OECD, we also calculate other aspects of the fatality rate. In some countries, here we see Mexico and Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia, we see that the mortality excess rate during the pandemic is well above reported deaths. In the OECD alone, we have estimated that based on this methodological estimate, COVID is responsible for at least 2.5 million deaths in our member countries. And as we all know, those most affected in terms of COVID deaths, we're looking at the age group of 60 plus, with over 50% of those who have died due to COVID being in that group. In addition to this, we have the other issues having to do with what's called long COVID, or other issues, depression, mental illness, and other issues that are linked to COVID and to lockdowns and to isolation. In countries like Mexico and the US and the UK, we have seen a drastic increase in mental illness. In Mexico, the rate of mental illness has increased more than tenfold. And so, as I was saying in the beginning, we're facing a situation that is far from being under control, first of all, because of the vaccine challenge, but also because of the consequences that the pandemic has wrought and where the communities stand in terms of what we need to overcome it. The impact of this increase in deaths is something we have seen also in the life expectancy numbers. As a matter of fact, if you look at these numbers, it's pretty shocking, because if we see what has happened in a number of OECD countries, I know in other countries as well in Latin America, we see that this is the equivalent of the gains that we had achieved over the last decade. The increase in longevity and life expectancy over the course of 10 years, to lose that in 1 year, that's significant backsliding. I mean, this is something that has affected some countries in particular. We have Italy, Poland, and Spain, and the UK, where life expectancy is pretty much where it was in 2010. In the US, this is almost 1 year less compared to life expectancy in 2010. There has been a drop in 1.5 or 1.6 in that life expectancy due to the pandemic in other places. In addition to the health impact and the macroeconomic impact overall, we need to also focus more on jobs, because ultimately pensions ultimately rely on capital markets, but also on continuity of contributions, how regularly these contributions continue to be made. The amount of those contributions ultimately determine the health of pensions. Now, if we were to look at the last quarter in 2019, compare it to today, that's a year and a half since the pandemic appeared and reached our countries, we see that this economic recovery that we have seen has picked up more recently thanks to the relief packages released by governments. But in most countries, there really hasn't been a recovery in the job sector. These job numbers are still well below what we saw in the pre-pandemic period, which is alarming, because when it comes to pensions, there's a direct link of dependence in healthy pensions and job growth and job maintenance. We see here a number of countries, South Africa and the US and other countries represented. And what we see is that over the last year and a half, we have taken a hit. And in the time ahead of us still, we see that this really has become the perfect storm. It has had an impact on income levels for employees. It has affected jobs themselves, but also has had an impact on financial market volatility. Now, of course, there is room for being optimistic. There are a few reasons why we should feel hopeful, and we should always be able to trust in government to maintain a certain level of economic stability. However, we still do have a long road ahead of us before we can go back to the normality we hope to once again find when it comes to job growth and economic stability. Now, there's another specific issue I wanted to mention, and it has to do with young people in our society. Of course, from a health perspective, as we said, those who have been the hardest hit have been senior citizens in nursing homes and in retirement homes. We know that some of the biggest numbers behind the fatality rate have come from these places. But if we look at this from an economic perspective, young people are facing the biggest challenges in adjusting to the new reality in the labor market, in finding jobs, for example, when you have companies who are facing a lot of uncertainty and are unstable. This is also harder to do because of lockdowns. It's harder to turn to a specific business and try to engage and find a job. And what we see in this graph here, as you can see, is an increase. But given this scourge that we already face in this society, and that is the lack of jobs for young people. In some OECD countries, as I already mentioned, we have seen a considerable hit in this regard. On the left, what we see is what we call the NEET youth, or not in employment or out of school young people. We see in Latin America, in Colombia, and in Costa Rica, for example, there have been some concerning increases of these rates. In both cases, we're talking about 7 to 8%. Additionally, this is an issue that, as I mentioned before, doesn't have a clear short-term solution. Now, of course, economic recovery has been picking up, but there are also shifts taking place. We see technology disruptions, we see changes in innovation and in processes, and that is going to limit the amount of jobs. Of course, there's going to be greater productivity, but it won't necessarily come with more jobs. And this is in a way a reference to what Benigno was talking about. From the OECD, we see this as an alarming issue. This is concerning for young people, also concerning for young women who, in this new, more technology-driven world, women don't necessarily have the same access to STEM. We have seen some significant achievement gaps and significant gender gaps when it comes to technological advancement. And that could potentially make these gaps more persistent when we try to address jobs for young people and the impact it will continue to have on young women. There is going to be a need for significant efforts to address this situation. As Benigno mentioned, this is one of the issues being looked at, and it's ultimately linked to what's happening with pensions as well. I would say that if there is a key takeaway that I would like for everyone to walk away with today, is that we want more resilient, more strong, more inclusive, and sustainable and green pension systems. And all of that fully depends on economies that are also characterized by these traits. In that sense, we have been trying to build monitoring systems in our economies that reflect the kinds of characteristics that we want to find not only in our economies, but also in our pension systems. These indicators that you see here are indicators that we have developed over the last few months, and we presented this at the last ministerial held this year. What you can see here under resilience is issues like the coverage rate for COVID-19, when it comes to how inclusive economic recovery has been. We're looking at the amount of young people who are out of work and out of school and are not in training, once again, sometimes referred to as NEET youth. We are also looking at sustainability and green and trying to get a sense of how green the recovery has been. We are really trying to create the path that will lead us to the Paris Agreement goals from 2015. And this is something that is also going to be absolutely vital in preserving our economies. Now, perhaps I can leave you with a specific thought on uncertainties, the kinds of uncertainties still ahead of us. There are uncertainties that are related to, first and foremost, this adjustment to the post-COVID world. We all want to know when the pandemic will end, when we're going to be able to move around freely once again. And I do believe that how much we can control this will really have to do with how much we can provide coverage and protect most people. That is a goal that needs to be set, and not something that we address based on the vaccines that come out and who gains access. I believe that this is an absolute need. And as we know, there are some countries that are lagging very far behind. The multilateral system and the international organization system, the international community, is working on helping the countries who have yet to gain access to a sufficient amount of doses and who have not been able to implement the necessary processes and the logistics in order to provide access to its communities to the vaccine. I believe that that is going to be the determining factor for being able to adjust to the post-COVID world. As I mentioned as well, we're going to have to continue to live alongside these variants going forward, but we hope that in the future it is going to be less concerning, less alarming, and it will have a less of a tragic impact on health. Now, at the same time, I believe that COVID has, sure, wreaked havoc and left us with a great deal of tragic situations, but has also been behind a lot of transformation. And where we have seen this transformation most acutely has been in the digitalization processes in our economies. For example, the increased number of cases approved for people being able to work from home. And the other aspects of this new digital reality that show us a very different world from where we were before when it comes to the labor market. Now, there are other issues in the future that are also going to have an impact on our pension systems. The first, as I mentioned, is that we have seen a big push from governments. However, there has been a quick increase in demand, and that was at a time when supply had been impacted by the panic created from COVID. And so there are some imbalances that are starting to emerge in our economies. We have seen the bottlenecks and the inflation coming from this. Also, there's been an increase in public expenditure, which is going to, at some point, lead to adjustments needed in the future. All of this creates a landscape that is fairly complex in the near term and medium term that will need to go through adjustments, and governments will have to transition and pivot towards a new economic model, one that is more sustainable, as I mentioned, but also one that is more resilient, which we saw was lacking given the impact of the pandemic. If we fast forward a little bit, as I mentioned, there are a few mega trends, as we call them, that are going to really have an impact on economies and will determine how our pension systems will be able to stand up in the future. We have a scale up of the use of AI, of digitalization, scientific innovation. We have climate change and biodiversity loss and all of the changes that are taking place in this area. Now, we're no longer talking about the digital industry, rather the digitalization of our entire economic apparatus. And that is going to really pull back the curtain on the major gaps that exist right now on who has access to what they need and who doesn't. Again, climate change, this is something that following the last summit at Glasgow is leading to a renewed focus and increase in the level of ambition and a full overhaul of the goals that businesses have set for themselves, but also the efforts going forward. In terms of demographics, we are now seeing what had been cooking for a long time. We are seeing how uneven some regions have been when it comes to demographic shifts. In Africa, for example, we see a major difference in the different demographic groups. And we know that the shifting wealth and influence to Asia is also a factor that is having a major impact on pension funds. Now, if we take a quick look at climate action and also think about the zero carbon goals, in this case, looking specifically at greenhouse gases, what I can say is that the clock is running out. We no longer have as much time as we had before to make the necessary adjustments. The more we wait, the more costly the necessary adjustments are going to be. And also we need to see changes in our consumption patterns. We know that there are some countries that are already moving in the right direction, doing everything they can, but other countries that have announced changes but have yet to implement them. Now, the targets that have been set are absolutely necessary targets in order to try to keep some of the major changes in the climate from happening. But we know that what has been announced so far brings us closer to achieving the targets, but we're not quite there in terms of the effort being made. Over the last few years, that has led to some changes in our financial industry. We have seen that in mutual funds, in the banking sector overall. And of course, pension funds have seen these changes as well, with a more full or in-depth implementation of ESGs. Now, it's no longer a matter of whether risks can be managed, but rather this as absolute necessity to address portfolios that may have no yields in the future. Corporations and businesses are now aligning themselves with the higher and more ambitious goals that have been announced by governments. So what still needs to happen for the industry to be able to continue working going forward? Well, obviously the new technologies, but also regulations, the kinds of regulations that can help us get a better understanding on what the quantification process is for the carbon footprint and for emissions, and how this all impacts the finances and what accounting firms and other financial institutions can add to this conversation. The Glasgow conversation on net zero led to 130 trillion in pledges for the net zero goals for 2030. Obviously, this is all going to lead to a pretty impactful change, not only in portfolios, but also create a lot of opportunities for higher yields and profitability and other financial opportunities. There's another major trend that I wanted to focus on. And I mentioned this before, but this is the digitalization of our economies. This will require higher skills. And of course, this is also going to create opportunities in pension systems to improve how they're administered and managed, how to provide better counsel for members, but also how to have more periodic conversations with members in order to have a more honed in approach, how to have more specific conversations having to do with the needs of the members themselves, using AI to not only improve communication, but also improve the way that the assets are managed in a way that also brings management more in line with the needs and the specific desires of the different members. Now, there's another major trend that is going to have a determining impact on how economies fare throughout the world, and also what this ultimately means for pension funds. And this has to do with the demographic shift that we're seeing now in a large part of the globe. We have seen people living longer, this aging population in different parts of the world, but we also know that in Africa, there's an expected 1 billion people, or rather, there's an expected increase in the population by 1 billion. That, given the potential for climate change to continue to become more severe, this could lead to major disruptions. And it's something that's going to require also a lot of cooperation between government and the private sector, and will also require engagement from multilateral organizations to address the development side of this and to also ensure that all of these young people in the labor market in Africa have the opportunities they need in order to self-realize. The last major trend I wanted to mention, this is another major component, and it has to do with the shift eastward, with the increase of China's economic power and the increased importance of Southeast Asia. We see here how we have growth from China that's in the double digits. We are looking at the export market and the impact that has had in this growth. Obviously, as we know, in the past, this has led to geopolitical tensions and the trade tensions. Now, there are other processes taking place that have to do with high tech. The major conversation is going to focus on these big challenges, which is going to be who is going to get there first, who is going to actually set the standard for this high tech. We're talking about 5G and quantum computing. Also, manufacturing and developing electric batteries. We know that some of these challenges have to do with the vaccines in China and the US and Europe. They're all competing and addressing this concern and hoping that this competition and this feud actually takes place still within this framework of the world order and transparency and competition, and to be able to all have a fair shot at winning this competition. All of this, I believe, is going to have a near-term, medium-term, and a long-term implications for the pension system. We're still going through a transition period. It is going to be a long transition. We still haven't come out of the tunnel that is the pandemic. Obviously, we're still learning how to live with the pandemic, but I do believe that there are still a few challenges to address both domestically and internationally in order to better prepare our economies and our societies to take on these challenges, as I mentioned, and mainly to take on these major trends. On the one hand, they can be seen as challenges, but on the other, they can also be seen as opportunities to be seized. That's the insight I wanted to share, the messages I wanted to leave with you all. Thank you once again for this opportunity to just share some of the information that has come out of the analysis and the assessments that we have conducted. Thank you very much. I look forward to the conversation. Juan, thank you very much. This was a fantastic talk. We have gotten a lot of questions via chat. And that's, of course, because our panelists and our attendees want to know more about your experience. Now, I do have two questions for you, Juan. Perhaps I can start with that, and then we can go from there. Does that work? Yes, absolutely. Please go ahead.
Juan, first of all, I wanted to ask you, how does the OECD see what is happening in terms of pensions in the Latin America and the Caribbean region? There are countries where there have been withdrawals made, and these could be added to withdrawals from the capitalization systems. That's the first question. The second question is, what will the effect of the pandemic be on the economy and on pensions regarding gender differences? How can we move forward with gender equality in the future? Thank you for those questions. As Benigno was also mentioning earlier, when we find ourselves in the worst health crisis we've had in the last century, a pandemic without precedent in our lives. It's essential for governments to find any possible way, first of all, to protect their citizens from the pandemic itself, of course, with health protection measures, that's universal, but also the government needs to protect its population's financial and economic well-being. Of course, we also need to protect employment, income, facilitate labor continuity, and that's why all these programs have been introduced that include part-time work to help families and workers keep their jobs. I think it has been a rapid and effective reaction in many countries in this search to, or this objective of maintaining the economy. But I don't think that these measures, these economic and health protection measures, need to be incompatible with our long-term objectives in our pension systems. In principle, it's precisely the pension systems that have long-term objectives that need to be as isolated as possible from those short-term tensions in order for them to be able to provide adequate benefits, which is what they were designed for. There might be situations where there's no access to public funds or public financing, and thus governments have decided to allow these early withdrawals to help the members deal with difficult short-term financial situations. It's understandable from one perspective, but at the same time, it is creating a serious risk for pensions in the future, and it's not clear how this will be corrected in the next few years. There will not be a great deal of capacity to make up for those losses in the resources that we've had for all these years. So I see this with concern. I think there were other alternatives possibly to these withdrawals. We might have been able to find other ways to obtain public financing so that we might be able to protect the pension funds as well as the employees. Regarding the second question on gender inequality, of course, this worries me because the pandemic, as we were saying earlier, has had a rather unequal impact in terms of access to employment opportunities and salary gaps that have widened again during the pandemic. And thus, we're facing a situation where much of the progress that had been achieved in reducing gender inequality now begins to be lost during this pandemic, and it might continue in this direction for the next few years. So we need to take clear and decisive action to correct all of these inequalities, whether it's by facilitating access to aid for families, access to preschool education. That's been one of the major obstacles for women in terms of being able to participate in employment and pension systems. Also, we need to correct imbalances and inequalities in the market, in companies, but we also need to find other ways to complement these efforts. We need to provide incentives for women to make contributions to pension funds, and some countries have been introducing some of these measures into their systems. Also, especially, I believe we need to do a regular monitoring of this inequality. We should have regular statistics on this gender gap so that we can implement the necessary policies to correct them. Thank you. We've received two more questions about one of the great challenges for our pension systems which is coverage for informal and self-employed workers. There has been an impact, a strong impact by the pandemic. What does the OECD recommend? How can we protect these workers from risk in their old age?
Esta es la gran problemática, digamos, que llevamos arrastrando.
This is a whole series of problems that we've been dragging along with us since the creation of our pension systems as well, of whatever type they might be. And it's the issue of informal workers, the informal economy, which has grown during the pandemic. And this requires a whole host of actions by governments. They need to promote education and training especially for those who are most vulnerable. Also, they need to eliminate any kind of administrative obstacles and other types of obstacles to participation in the formal market for those most vulnerable workers. So it's not a single solution, it's a whole series of actions that governments need to take. Some are introducing financial incentives to complement contributions for the lower salaries, and these are measures that in and of themselves will not provide a solution to the problem, because after all, informality is closely linked to the country's per capita income levels and the economic development of a country, but undoubtedly it might help improve the situation for many of the informal workers. There's one final question. We've received many questions, but due to time constraints, we'll have this one last question for this round. In your opinion, unemployment rates that we are seeing now, are they temporary, just a reaction to COVID, or are we looking at a more structural issue that is due to new trends in the workplace or new technologies? Good question. Whenever there's a recession or a time of economic weakness, this is always a relevant question. And as we know, the answer rather is often a little of both. Any rise in unemployment can lead to a more structural type of unemployment, a long-term unemployment, and that is already happening in some of our economies, as it did after the financial crisis, more in some countries than in others, because it depends on the ability to adjust and mobility in the economy and the ability to create jobs as well. But the second part of the question is very important, because many of the new businesses, the new dynamism in the business world is often something we see on a large scale. These companies are present on a large scale, but their mass is lower. They don't perhaps have the ability to create enough value added. And this is something that often affects technological companies, and this leads us to reflect on to what extent can our population, or a good part of our population, of our labor market, is truly prepared to deal with those technological challenges and to participate in those sectors where we will be seeing and are already seeing a good part of our economic growth and of value added to our economies. And at the OECD, for example, we've calculated that automation and digitization processes that are affecting many jobs are putting 15% approximately of our jobs at risk within the OECD countries, and approximately another 35% of occupations will see rather dramatic transformation. So the ability to move, to pivot toward new jobs will be decisive, and it will depend on having access to training, which is currently basically only available to a minority within the labor force. So that's the big challenge after COVID, I would say, to truly prepare our labor force for the coming changes.